He missed it by 60 seconds. It was the kind of miss that stood a man up entirely. No graceful recovery, no quick-thinking sprint. Only the cold, humiliating pause of someone who watched the clack of wheels and the glow of taillights slide away from under his feet. Oliver Hale watched the doors close, the platform light swallowing that last rectangle of possibility. And for a second, he considered going back to the office. There were unsent emails, a half-empty thermos, the bruised look that long hours leave at the corners of your eyes. Then the platform emptied toward the taxi ranks and the office towers, and the city resumed the slow, indifferent hum that had kept him punctual for 12 years. His hands were full of other people's lives, contracts, forecasts, project timelines. He kept his shoes shined because appearances were currency. He kept his calendar because panic ate him from the inside. Tonight, those tools failed him. He stood in the scraped light of the platform as if someone had rewired his punctuality. The next train was due in 20 minutes. He could have paid for a cab. He lived 2 stops from his apartment, a short, familiar ride, but paying was an admission of defeat. Instead, he checked his phone, thumbed through emails, and found himself unable to focus. He felt absurdly like a man suspended over a gap between 2 floors of a building. One step too far, and the ground would be gone. At the far end of the platform, a young woman laughed into her phone with the kind of easy abandon Oliver hadn't made room for in years. 2 teenagers argued about headphones. One of them kept glancing at the clock with the same impatient energy Oliver had once carried. They boarded the commuter train when it came, a commuter tide, and it carried them away. He waited. The clock on the platform blinked its pale numbers like a metronome. He began to count. When the train slid in, slick and quiet, it was not the crowded clatter he expected. It was almost empty. Not just thinly populated, but eerily sparse. 7 cars that might have held 100 people each now held only a handful. The lights hummed a little too steady. The doors sighed shut with an exaggerated deliberateness. The conductor nodded at Oliver as if to say, "Better luck next time," and then moved on. Oliver boarded because he had nowhere else to go, and because the night had stretched its hand over him. He took a seat by the window. The carriage smelled faintly of coffee and something else, metal, maybe, or the faint dust of long unused things. He tapped his phone once, twice. No messages. He stared at his reflection and felt suddenly foreign to himself. The man in the glass had the same hair, same tie, same tired jaw, but his eyes seemed like borrowed glassware. The carriage was not entirely empty. 2 seats down, a man in his 60s read from a paperback, one finger keeping his place as if the pages might slip from him. Across the aisle, a woman in a wool coat closed her eyes like someone trying to block out the world. A young man, perhaps 25, stared at the floor and whistled without sound. Near the doors, a woman in a red scarf wiped at her hands, repeatedly, as if trying to get something off her skin. At the end of the car was a figure that made him pause. The man or woman, or neither, wore the kind of clothes that answered to no particular era: a dark coat, high collar, hands tucked in pockets. The silhouette looked drilled into his memory like the corners of a photograph left too long in the sun. They had a face shaped by careful angles. The eyes, when they lifted and met his for a fraction of a second, felt like recognition from inside his skull. Oliver shut his mouth. He had not seen that face in years, and yet he could have drawn it from memory at age 10. He had to fight the urge to stand and walk over. He told himself that familiar faces existed in cities, an entire human economy of resemblance. The train shuddered and pulled out of the station, and as it did, the familiar face turned a page of nothing and looked away. For the first hour, nothing remarkable happened. The lights hummed, the city dissolved into tunnels, then into stretches of open track with street lamps like sentries, and Oliver's circuit board of anxieties glowed and dimmed. He found the familiar patterns of traveling, the distant shout of a child, the press of air when doors opened at a stop that had no passengers, and he anchored to them. He told himself the empty train was a fluke, a late-night special, maintenance windows, a pandemic echo. He told himself what he always told himself when the world felt uncertain. Control the controllables, file the feelings away. At the first station, after halfway through the line, the doors swished open and the platform lay in shadow. The lights inside the carriage shimmered, and then, briefly, one bulb at the far end went out and came back on. It was little more than a glitch, a flicker. He glanced at the older man reading the paperback. His finger rested between pages. The woman's face in the wool coat was slack and pale. The young man still whistled, notes swallowed by the walls. The woman in the red scarf rubbed the wetness from her palms with new urgency, as if the rubbing might erase a stain only she could see. Then the lights failed. They did so not as an extinguishing, but as a closing, one after another like eyelids. The carriage slipped into a darkness that was not complete, but thickened around the edges. His phone screen cut to black. The humming slowed until it was almost bone deep. For a moment, no one moved. A new sound threaded into the hollow, like whispering from the vents or water moving under concrete. A sliver of the train's internal light pinged back, then fizzed out, and when the glow returned, one of the passengers was gone. The seat where the young man had sat was empty. Not empty the way a seat is empty when someone stands to go to the door. There was no folded magazine, no dropped scarf, no sign that any human being had existed there at all. It was like the seat had been painted into existence without the man. His first reaction was logical, corporate. Check the CCTV, tell the conductor, make sure there was no accidental stop. He turned, expecting the older man to be slowly shaking his head, looking at the woman or pulling out his phone. The older man's paperback remained folded, finger lodged like a bookmark, but his eyes were closed. Oliver stood. The rest of the carriage watched with the soft, stunned attention of people who had just seen a voice leave the room. The woman in the red scarf was gone too. He moved toward the door. The glass looked into the next car. It was empty. He walked through, and the emptiness stretched. The next car, empty. The next, empty. In some cars, items floated in strange arrangements, an unattended briefcase, a trail of scattered sugar packets, a child's toy balanced on a seat, but no people, no conductor in sight. He pushed the button to open the doors at the next stop, and the doors hissed but did not slide. The indicator above them showed the station name, Oakview. The train slowed and the lights flickered again, but the doors stayed closed. The glass turned to mirror. In that silvered pane, his face stared back at him, and for a second he saw not one self, but many. Reflections stacked like photographs, each one slightly different, each one a version of his life sliding like frames on a moving reel. "Excuse me," he said aloud. No one answered. When the next moment happened, he did not see it coming. A hand, thin, almost skeletal, pressed to the inside of the glass between cars. It trembled, not with age, but with something like hunger, and then it was gone, as if someone never had been there to begin with. Oliver's throat closed. He moved down the aisle and found the conductor sleeping on the bench near the cab, head bobbing, a ticket scanner dangling from her hand like a broken appendage. He shook her. Hey, wake up!" She opened her eyes slow and apologetic, like a person waking from a permissible sleep. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Late night." She smiled. More dangerous than the vanished people were the places where the train opened to dark tunnels. In those tunnels, the track went on and on like a seam that had been cut and left to bleed. Air moved through them without sound. Occasionally, the train would slow and the lights would stretch like tired eyes, and something in the tunnel would be visible. A figure at the far end, small as a pebble, moving slow and puppet-like, or a cluster of faces caught in the wall, pressed like coins into clay. Once, at the lip of one of those tunnels, a child's voice called "Daddy," with a timbre that folded into Oliver's spine. He tried to jot down everything. His notes filled the notebook, entries that began with date and time and dissolved into lists of impressions. He slept less. Sleep became a rumor. He ate at odd hours, sometimes not at all. Plants withered on his kitchen counter. Work suffered. He missed meetings. He blanked out during a conference call. His colleagues noticed, but no one intervened beyond the polite bureaucracy of concern. "Get some rest," they said. "Delegates should be on hand." No one asked if he was on a train that kept taking him home and then away from home again. The loops were not identical. Sometimes the train reached the depot and the conductor slept through it and left. Sometimes it snaked down to an underground facility where the lights were fluorescent and the walls smelled of vinegar. Once it stopped at a station with an advertisement for a play he'd never seen, a show that featured a man missing his train. Each time a thread of recognition grew. The loops fed on his attempts to fix them. Try one solution and the world rearranged so that solution could no longer apply. His attempts to break the loop were like someone trying to open a door that rewired itself into a wall. The figure with the familiar face began to change. At first, that person simply looked at him like an answered question. Then, in one loop, they spoke. "You shouldn't be here," they said, which was obvious and therefore ominous. Their voice made the word "shouldn't" into a thing that held a consequence. "It's the train," Oliver replied stupidly. It keeps us," the person corrected, "or it keeps what we can't hold." It was a metaphor he did not have. "Who are you?" he asked. They smiled without warmth. Names are sometimes the last things to go. One night, driven by an irrational intuition, he followed the figure when they stepped off at a station that read Oldwell. Oldwell had more of the dead present than other stops. Rust, the skeletal architecture of a platform, the smell of mold, and a ragged poster advertising a band that had not played in 20 years. The figure moved toward a stairwell and turned to look back at him as if to say he should come. Oliver followed. At the bottom of the stairwell was a room that never been on a train map. It smelled of books and engines, of electrical tang and old coffee. Chairs lined the walls. A single desk lamp burned. Near it, a small group of people sat in a ring. They recognized them now. The woman with the wool coat, the older man with the paperback, the woman with the red scarf, the whistler. The familiar-faced person stood between them with his hands folded. "You're late," the woman with the scarf said. Her voice had lost its self-rubbing edginess. She spoke with the flat clarity of someone readied for surrender. "What's this? What is this place?" "An office, a tribunal," the Whistler said dryly. "We call it many things." The older man with the book set it down, closing the cover with deliberate slowness. "Why are we here?" Oliver demanded. Panic colored his voice now. The familiar-faced person finally stepped forward. In the weak light, Oliver could see the angles of the face, the hint of a mole near the jaw, the way the eyes were set with a small, cruel patience. "Because the train insists on asking its questions," they said. "Because you earned entry." "Earning?" Oliver's protest was half-formed. Guilt had a costume and a script in his mind. He could not find either to wear. "I take the train," he said. "I missed it once, twice, thrice. I don't belong." "Do you remember Grantham?" the woman in the wool coat asked. The word hit him like a physical shove. Grantham. It fluttered like a sheet caught on a line in his memory. There was a date attached to it sometimes, when he could catch the thread. A winter, 3 winters ago? And an accident. He had been in a meeting the day the news came through. Minor derailment, no fatalities reported. The company lawyers handled statements. He had signed things. He had made sure the press had a narrative that leaned toward unfortunate. "Grantham?" he repeated. "The junction, the platform, the schedule." He tapped his palm with a finger like someone closing a book. A man with a briefcase got off the curve too fast. A child ran for a dropped teddy. An engineer tried to correct a signal, and Oliver's mind supplied images that belonged to other people's nightmares. The screech of brakes, the metallic wrench of bodies being thrown. He had read the memo. He had annotated it. He had forwarded it. He had written low impact in the margin and put the company's responsibilities on hold. He had never visited the site. He had not seen the faces of the families who called. He had been careful. He could not finish. He felt like someone on the stage of an old theater who had missed the cue. The words slid out of him like misplaced actors. "I didn't know." "People do not simply vanish," the Whistler said. "People die. People are broken. A loop is a machine for attention. It will not let you look away until you look at what you have helped make." He tapped the paperback with a knuckle. "The book says the same." It landed on him then, sharp and absurd, the idea that the train might be less a mechanical system than a moral one. The carriage, the tunnels, the empty seats were not accidents or ghosts, but evidence. The loops were not punishment in the old sense, they were mechanisms of reckoning. He had been a man who made decisions like a ledger. Decisions were not abstract. They made places where people fell between the numbers. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "We want your answer. We want you to say it aloud." There was something in their insistence that made Oliver's tongue feel heavy. "Why were you there on the day of Grantham?" He had been at the planning meeting, whiteboard, diagrams, a voice from legal, numbers projected, his own name attached to a schedule. He had negotiated cost constraints and delayed infrastructure repairs. He had not wanted to spend money. He had rationalized. He had weighed the trade-offs: profit, delay, risk. He had signed off on a timeline that left a switch untested. He could not bring himself to say, "I signed." He said instead, "We were managing assets. We had priorities. You deferred maintenance for the quarter. You made a call that delayed a fix. There were meetings where you argued solidly and convincingly against an extra inspection. You wrote the memo." Everything inside him bristled and collapsed as if electricity struck. The ledger of his life had a page ripped out, one that he had not allowed himself to read. He had called it resource allocation. Later, in quieter times, he had called it efficiency. Now it had a human face pressed to it like a coin. It had names and dates and a thread of a child's handwriting on a bereaved mother's letter.
Tears came suddenly and without warning. He surprised himself and the others. He had always worn his emotions like cufflinks, select, polished, useful. But now they leaked. "I didn't mean," and his voice cracked because it had been unused. The circle of faces had a sympathy that did not feel like absolution. "No one does," the woman with the scarf said. "That isn't enough here." "Then what?" he asked. They were quiet for a long time. The room's lamp hummed. The train moved above them like some enormous animal. "You must remember," said the familiar-faced person. "You must remember the names." So he did. He remembered the engineer who liked to whistle under his breath, the cleaner who always folded newspapers in half, the mother who had a habit of tucking curls behind her ear, the child who liked to count the windows on the train and knew every station by heart. A dozen names at first, then more. As he spoke them, the room warmed like a wound reacting. The faces in the circle softened. Something inside him that resented pain and denied culpability began to unravel. "You must tell their stories," the whistler said bluntly. "Not to us. To yourself. To the train." "How?" Oliver asked. "Speak their names each time you ride. Don't let the loop be neat. Fill it with weight. Let it be messy. Let it be true."
The older man with the paperback recalled a wife who liked lavender soap. The woman in the scarf had once been a school teacher who taught children how to spell their names. The whistler had a dog called Fergus. The familiar-faced person, whom Oliver had never found a name for, began, piece by piece, to offer memories. They were not his, but they were close enough to let him speak. Each name he spoke made the empty seats feel less like erasures and more like pages in a ledger that had been waiting for ink. The loop shifted. It was not gone. No, nothing of that magnitude left as cleanly as that, but it changed shape. The train still opened to dark tunnels and drew breath in odd places, but the absences returned less regularly. Sometimes the conductor would help. Sometimes she would be kind. The figure with the familiar face removed layers, sometimes their coat, sometimes the posture, and revealed that they were also a person with reasons and contradictions. Sometimes the familiar face would read the book that the older man had carried when it was supposed to be closed. Sometimes they would sit and see the photographs and murmur. Once, when a child ghost pressed their small palm to the window, the figure answered with a soft, "I'm here." Oliver slept less, but when he did sleep, he dreamed lucidly of small mercies. A child's laughter returned to a mother's ears. A misplaced teddy bear found under the seat where someone had left it as if by accident. The train stopped at small stations he had never seen, and passengers, once vanished, now lingered, their presence fragile but present. He began to understand a different form of repair. It was not legal settlements or memos or corporate assurance. It was neither public apology nor private donation. It was a practice, a discipline of noticing. The loops taught him to listen. They taught him the grammar of regret, not as a static thing, but as a verb. To regret meant to act upon memory, to alter the future by the input of truth. He wrote letters he never mailed. He called people he had avoided. He visited the families connected to Grantham and stuttered through an apology that felt like a raw scaffold around a ruined house. Some of them accepted him with the weary generosity of people who had learned to live with a damage that didn't ask for permission to exist. Others turned away. A few asked him nothing but to be remembered. He did not know whether remembering was enough, but he did it because the train had made his alternatives worse. Then, deep into the spiral of these rituals, the loops started to give him gifts. On a stormy night, when the carriage lights trembled, the familiar-faced person,
sat across from him, and without ceremony took his hand. "You have done more than you admit," they said. "You have moved, you have named, you have tried." Oliver wanted to tell them the truth, that much of his change was mechanics, an arrangement of fear and shame, that the habit of naming might in the end be another performance. He looked down at the two hands, his and theirs, and felt an unexpected tenderness. "Why us?" he asked. "Because we were caught," they said simply. "Because each of us did a thing, and each of us also had a life, and both things matter. The train collects traction from the things left unfinished." As if to illustrate, the train slid into a tunnel where the walls were lined with dozens of photographs, pinned like dead moths. The images were of stations, of small domestic scenes, of people leaning on counters, of a child asleep on a couch, mouth open in trust. The photographs were not the crude work of ghosts, but the careful, human kind, prints that smelled like dust and life. Someone had taken the time to mount them here. Someone had organized a memory gallery. "Who put them here?" Oliver asked. The familiar-faced person smiled ruefully. "Those who refused to be erased." It mattered, Oliver discovered, who refused. The loop had not been a punishment exacted by a cosmic judge, but a community's effort to preserve memory. The conductor who kept a log, the older man whose book contained marginalia of faces and names, the woman with the red scarf who had sewn names into the hems of scarves, the whistler who whistled tunes that summoned the soft corners of people's lives. Each of them had a way of resisting oblivion. He began, in simple human ways, to join them. He started small. He brought extra coffee to the exhausted conductor. He sat with the older man and discussed the mythologies of sleep until the book's margin was full of new notes. He bought a scarf for the woman who rubbed her hands clean, and left it for her with a note that said only, "For warmth." He taught the whistler a tune on a train platform piano that had not been tuned in 10 years. The train's hunger did not stop entirely, but it softened around edges like bread warmed. The loops receded like a tide. They didn't end in a dramatic rupture of light, but in the quiet accumulation of small, accountable acts. One night, an ordinary night marked only with the mundane fact that he'd had too many coffees, Oliver missed his usual train. He boarded the next one. The carriage at first looked the same as all the others, a scattering of people, the hum of fluorescent lights, the click of the rails. He sat by the window and saw in the reflection not his own face, as he had done for weeks now, but a composite. His face overlaid with the older man's, the whistler's, the woman in the wool coat. They looked like a family photograph. When the lights failed, no one vanished. The train slowed at Oakview, and the doors opened to a platform soaked with ordinary night air. A child laughed somewhere beyond the tracks. The conductor, whose name Oliver had learned only after a long campaign of asking, was Marta, smiled and said, "We're running fine tonight." Her eyes, when they met his, had something like peace. He left the train and walked home under a sky that seemed only faintly different, not so much brighter as less anxious. He had carried the night in his pockets for a long time. Now he felt it loosen. On the next morning, he sat in his office and found himself writing a memo he didn't have to write. It was not about profit margins or deferred inspections. It was a human memorandum, a small document that suggested invest in safety, revisit old cases, apologize to families harmed by corporate indifference. He sent it to legal and to HR, and to the kind of person in his company who understood the rhythms of efficacy.
He did not expect much. He knew the machinery of corporate change was slow and savage, but sending the memo felt like closing a loop. That night, he took the train again, because habit dies last, and because part of his redemption, he felt, was to keep showing up. The carriage held faces he had come to care for, and others he did not know. The familiar-faced person sat in the corner, hands folded like a prayer. At the next station, a child boarded, bright and uneven, with a mother who laughed like a bird. He watched them and felt a joy that frightened him with its pureness. When the lights stuttered, a natural kink from wayward electricity or the city's tired wiring, he held his breath but did not panic. He listened to the conversations around him. He thought of names. He thought of letters he had written, and lunches he had bought, and apologies he had fumbled into the long dark. He thought of Grantham, and he did not try to erase himself from it because he had learned that erasure was a participation in the forgetting of others. When he stepped off the train at his stop, he realized he had not counted the minutes, had not rehearsed the next day's damage control language. He felt the city's breath on his neck, ordinary and indifferent, and he felt, too, a new kind of responsibility, even if it was only an everyday one, the responsibility to remember, to insist, to act. Weeks later, on a day when the city had a brimming kind of light, and he had, for reasons that were gentle and not dramatic, a spare hour, he stood on the platform and watched trains come and go. He noticed a family with a stroller, a teenage couple, an old man with a warm hat. He could have walked past and left the lives of others to the indifferent mechanisms of time. Instead, he walked towards a woman who stood at the edge of the platform, looking at a notice board where someone had posted photographs, a collection of faces, smiling, small notes attached. He'd seen that wall before, in the tunnel under Oldwell. Now it was on the platform, accessible to anyone. They rode in silence a while, and the train hummed. When the lights flickered, a familiar reflex, he let it be. This time, when the hand pressed against the glass, it was a small child's palm, and the child on the platform reached back and was given a wave. Nothing vanished. "Look," said Mara, and pointed at the window. Outside, the tracks braided into the city and then opened into the soft blue of a pending morning. The world ahead felt like a map with more open space than before. He did not claim victory. He did not want to tempt whatever machinery still drove the loops. He knew better to trust absolutes. But he also knew, more clearly than ever, the shape of a life he wanted. A life in which he noticed the names on the list, sent letters that might do nothing, kept an eye on a station log, sat through uncomfortable meetings and asked the difficult questions. It was not glamorous. It was, perhaps, enough. As the train slowed for his stop, he rose, feeling the ordinary tiredness of a man who had done a day's work and a long night's penance. He stepped onto the platform, and the air tasted like rain and the city. He looked back only once, and in the carriage he saw a woman with a wool coat closed around her shoulders, an old man adjusting his paperback, a whistler practicing a tune, and Mara smiling as she folded a small photograph into her pocket. The familiar-faced person, no longer merely familiar, but known, met his eyes and nodded as if to say that, for now, the train could rest. He walked home under the quiet, ledgered sky. He had missed a train and caught the next one, relived moments until they reshaped him, and in the process learned how to hold others. The loops had been a brutal tutor, but at their end, They left him with a practice he could sustain without fear of spectacle, remembering, naming, and acting. He opened his front door and found the light of his apartment warm and welcome. He paused on the threshold and thought of the many people on many trains, of the way walls remember, of the lives that refuse to fit into spreadsheet rows. He took off his coat and smoothed his tie and, as if answering an old arrangement, picked up his notebook. On the page, he wrote one name after another in a slow, deliberate hand. The ones he had known, the ones he'd loved, the ones he had harmed. He did not think about redemption in grand terms. He thought of small acts and daily practices. He thought of boards with photographs and the conductor who kept a log. He thought of the familiar-faced person who had been both stranger and match to his conscience. Outside, the city kept moving. Trains went past his window in long, quiet lines. Somewhere, another commuter missed a platform by 60 seconds and boarded the next train. Somewhere else, people opened doors into dark tunnels and found photographs on the walls. Somewhere else, hands pressed to glass and met other hands. He placed the pen down, and for a long time, he simply listened to the settling of his apartment, the refrigerator humming, the distant echo of the city's brakes. He felt plainly and without spectacle the slow realignment of a life towards something durable, the hard work of remembering. That night he slept. When he woke the next morning, the world was not perfect. It never was. But there was the train, and the knowledge that someone was at the bulletin board posting a new photograph, and someone else who would not let the faces be rubbed away. He took his keys and left the house with the simple certainty that he would ride again, that he would miss trains sometimes, and that when the world offered him loops, he would use them to name names and to hold the stories of others like a lantern in the dark. The last train, he thought once as he walked, is really not the last at all. It is the one that keeps coming back until we learn to look up and speak.